Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Tim. Thank you for that introduction. Like she mentioned, I'm the editor of a section at the New York Times called Smarter Living. I'm super happy to be here today, and I'm thrilled to talk with you about service journalism. And thank you so much to the Korea Press Foundation for inviting me to speak with you guys. It's truly an honor. And this is my first time in South Korea, and it's been amazing so far. I've just been walking around and taking it all in, and it's been really exciting to see your city. And the food has been amazing, as I'm sure you know. I feel like I've eaten my body weight in kimchi in the last few days. But I didn't come to talk about kimchi or Korean food. I'm here to talk about service journalism. And I'm probably a little bit biased here, but I think service journalism is one of the most exciting things happening at the New York Times. We're working on some incredible stuff with a lot of different parts of the company, and I can't wait to share a lot of it with you. And I'm going to apologize in advance to our translator. When I get excited, I talk really fast. So if I talk too fast, just yell at me. But so before we get to service journalism and smarter living and all the cool things we're doing at the Times, I want to talk a little bit about the history of how we got here. Because in kind of a cool way, the story of smarter living is kind of the story of the New York Times and its evolution and the new digital age. And there's a lot of parallels between what the company and what the newsroom is doing overall and what's going on with smarter living. So a little context and a little background about the history of digital innovation at the Times. Print advertising in the US is declining and will continue to decline and is probably never going to come back. We all know this. This is not new information. It's been cratering for about a decade. And in the last couple of years, the decline has been accelerating. It's getting even faster. A lot of places, including the New York Times, still manage to make a huge bulk of our overall revenue from print advertising. But year after year, that number is shrinking, and it's going to continue to shrink. So what do we do about this? How do we combat this? Right now, digital advertising doesn't replace the losses in print advertising. There's a lot of innovation happening in digital advertising. Publishers are turning to things like native ads and sponsored content and partnerships with big tech companies and companies in other industries. And these are all really exciting and great advancements. And the New York Times is doing a lot of these. We're running our own experiments around these. It's really cool stuff. But again, the point is digital advertising isn't replacing print advertising right now. It's possible maybe someday someone is going to figure out how to make digital advertising as robust as print advertising used to be, but no one's there yet. No one's even close to that. So that old advertising model has just been so fundamentally disrupted, and it's a model that a lot of the newspaper industry in the U.S. was really built off. So we need to evolve and we need to innovate and think about new paths forward. Every publisher is affected by this. The way we used to do things simply doesn't work anymore. So we need something new. What is that? So at the Times, for the past 15 years or so, we've been experimenting to create a lot of brand new services for readers and experiences that, one, really serve the reader, because that's the core of what we do. Everything is in service of the reader. But hopefully some of those experiments and ideas, will replace some of that lost print advertising revenue. So we'll go over a couple of things we've tried. We've tried paid apps and products around some of our pillars, like the crossword puzzle and our cooking app and our core news. This has taken a lot of forms. These two on the left is the crossword app and the right is cooking. These have been hugely successful. They're bringing in revenue for us and they're great reader experiences. But not everything that we've tried has been a success. We used to have an app, a mobile app called NYT Now. And that was kind of a slimmed down version of our main New York Times news app. It was kind of a digest. And when it launched, it was a paid product. So to get access to it, readers had to pay a monthly fee. It's not around anymore. It went away about a year and a half or 2 years ago. And we also had an app called NYT Opinion, which was kind of the same idea, except it was only based on stories and content coming from the opinion section. So nothing in the newsroom, just opinion. Again, it's not around anymore. But just because those two apps aren't around anymore doesn't mean we didn't learn a lot from them. And a lot of what we learned from those two apps, we've applied to the things that are still around. So the best parts of NYT Now live on in our core mobile app. Another thing that we've tried is product recommendations. So there's a website called Wirecutter. Are you familiar with Wirecutter? Has anybody heard of that out here? No, great. So Wirecutter is a product recommendation app. And so Wirecutter's thing is they go really, really deep into a given product. So for example, if they're trying to find the best vacuum that you should buy, they spend dozens of hours researching vacuums across the industry, talking to experts, convening panels, reading all the other reviews, seeing everything's out there. And at the end, they have, a 4,000 word or a 5,000 word guide that ends with one single vacuum that you should buy. So the New York Times acquired Wirecutter last year, and it brings in what's called affiliate revenue. So let's say you go to the Wirecutter and you buy that vacuum that they recommend, and you buy it through Wirecutter on one of the sites that they partner with. The New York Times is going to get a sliver of the money that goes into that. We also have a thriving events business, and this can take a lot of forms. This is things like Q&As with journalists, panels, things like that. Last week in New York, we had the Deal Book Conference, which is this, huge event headlined by Andrew Ross Sorkin, who runs Deal Book. He's on Squawk Box on CNBC. But it brings together a lot of industry leaders to talk about big ideas and talk about what they're up to. And they kind of interact with the readers of the New York Times, and it's really fun, and we have a lot of success with that. Next, we have T-Brand Studio. So T-Brand Studio is separate from the newsroom. It's separate from Opinion. It's in the advertising department. And a little earlier, I talked about native advertising and sponsored content. So with the New York Times, T-Brand Studio does that. They partner with advertisers to craft stories around messages that advertisers are trying to get in front of New York Times readers. It's only been around for a couple of years, but it's been hugely successful, and it's been really, really important as we're trying to bolster up our digital advertising business. And on top of all that stuff, we have a lot of other experiments. Smarter Living is a great example of that. Smarter Living was born out of this weird little experiment that me and my editor at the time did on the homepage. We'll talk about that. But more than any one thing or any product or any column or any service or anything, we've really kind of found that people just don't mind paying for the New York Times, whatever that looks like. And that's great. We're betting our future on that. We have a relationship with our readers that's really kind of unlike any other publisher in the world. People love the New York Times. They love reading it. They love contributing to it. They love talking about it. And now more than ever, they kind of don't mind paying for it. So through all of these experiments that we've run, all these apps, and all this research we've done, we've come to the conclusion that the path for the New York Times for the future is to become a subscriber-first business. So what does that mean? Essentially it means that we need to become less dependent on advertising, whatever form that takes. Print advertising, digital advertising, whatever. We need to kind of divorce ourselves from that a little bit and shift our focus really to growing our subscriber base. And how do we do that? Before we get to there, just a couple numbers on subscriptions. The New York Times has 3.5 million total paid subscriptions. That's like an insane number. In the US, that's like orders of magnitude bigger than anybody else. And it really speaks to that deep relationship we have with our readers. People just love the New York Times. And of those 3.5 million paid, 2.5 million are digital only, meaning they never get the print product. They just don't interact with it. They only read the New York Times through our website and our apps or newsletters, or one of the other digital-only products we have. Digital subscription revenue has increased 46% this year compared to last year, which is great. That's a huge, huge increase. And these numbers just came out like 2 weeks ago. This is our Q3 data that was just released. And overall at the company, our total revenue has increased 6% in the most recent quarter, which is more great news. There's, a lot of talk about the failing New York Times. That's become such a catchphrase. But the truth is that's simply not the case. We're on better financial footing than we have been in years. And it's because we've shifted our focus to be subscription first. And the last point on this is, our recent subscribers skew a little bit younger than our traditional subscribers. This is great because these are the subscribers that are going to take us into the future. And just the last thing on subscription first. So you'll see this graph starts in 2010, which is when we launched kind of one of the first iterations of our paywall, which just meant that to access New York Times stories after a certain number, you had to start paying. And you'll see this huge spike in 2015. And 2015 was the year that we really decided as a company that this was our future. This is what we're betting our future on, is subscribers first. And the result of that was we got a ton of new subscribers. So growing that subscriber base is, like I said, something that we think and we hope is going to carry us into the future. So now let's look a little bit look at how we are going to expand that subscriber base. And to get at that question, we have to kind of answer another pretty important question, which is, what is the New York Times? The New York Times helps readers understand the world by creating the most ambitious, innovative journalism in the world. And when people think of the New York Times, these are some of the things that they associate us with. The deep investigative reporting that you can't find anywhere else, the unmatched political scoops that come out of our Washington, D.C. bureau and out of New York, our international coverage, which is, industry leading, our magazine feature stories, and a lot of the award-winning news, videos, and documentaries that we produce. But we're learning to think of ourselves in much, much broader and bigger terms, rather than, being the investigative and political and international news juggernaut that people tend to think of us as. So what does that mean? So we still want to be all that. We still want to be the best news outlet in the world. But, on top of that, we also want to be the destination for people who are looking for recommendations on what to watch TV tonight, or what to wear to a really fancy wedding, or how to deal with a rude coworker in the office, or what to know about taking an international trip to Seoul, for example. So one way to look at that is to kind of think about our traditional competitors. When you think about who the New York Times competes with in the media landscape, the same kind of names come to mind. It's the Washington Post and the Guardian and the Wall Street Journal and CNN and a lot of these more traditional, well-established other international news outlets. And we still compete with them, for sure. In the news arena, these are really kind of the major players that we still compete with. But we've sort of set our sights a little differently now. Now we really kind of view our competitors as Netflix and HBO and Snapchat and Spotify and any of the other ways that we spend our time online. We're all competing for attention, and it's not really the case anymore where people would sit down with their morning newspaper while they're eating breakfast or whatever. It's all in the same universe. Everybody's reading us on their smartphone, and on their smartphone is also Netflix or another news app or Twitter or Weibo or WhatsApp. Those are the types of things that we're competing with now. It's not just news. So how do we expand? What I'm really saying here is to thrive into the future, the New York Times needs to be a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So rather than just being like the go-to news outlet for some people, we sort of want to have something for everyone. If it's news, great, but if it's not news, we still want to be able to offer you something and help you live a better life in some way. We just need to write stories and shoot videos and graphics that are, continue to be world leading, and are so good that people don't think twice about paying. Because again, to hammer away at this point, we're a subscription first business and we need to expand that base. So how do we get there? A couple of different ways, and this list is not exhaustive, it's not complete, but these are some of the more interesting ways that we're doing it. One, we're thinking about new content and new lines of coverage. We're exploring new ways to get our stories to readers. In one of the previous presentations, they talked about a lot of platforms that outlets are on to disseminate all their news. That's really, really important. We can't rely on the traditional distribution channels the way that we used to. And we need to dream up new ways to tell our stories. And we need to be telling stories that are so compelling and so important and so unique that to not have a New York Times subscription is to not be experiencing the world completely. We need to be that important. And again, we're competing with HBO and Netflix and Weibo and Twitter. So we need to be able to capture people's attention and hold on to it. So that brings us to smarter living. We have finally arrived at what I'm actually here to talk about. So what is smarter living? Smarter living essentially is the home of service journalism at the New York Times. Okay, so what is service journalism? It's a good question, and a lot of different places have a lot of different ways of defining that. At the New York Times, we define it very simply. It's just any story that helps readers live better lives. That can mean a story about getting started biking to work, or how to find cheap airline tickets, or a Q&A about saving for retirement, or a 2,000-word guide on packing your carry-on luggage for traveling. Those are all stories that we've done. And here's just a couple examples of stuff we do. This isn't really new to the New York Times. This is a type of story that we've been doing since the Times was founded 160 some odd years ago. And it's funny, when we were first really thinking through smarter living and looking at what it could be and what it was and where the potential was, we would take these deep dives into the New York Times archives, and we would find these stories from like the 1920s and from the 1930s, where writers back then were telling readers how to stay cool during the summer. There wasn't any air conditioning, so you had to go pick up the physical New York Times to figure out how to stay cool during the summer. And there were stories about how to throw a dinner party. So this has really been in the DNA of the New York Times forever. But what's different now is that for the first time, we're really thinking very deliberatively about it and very cohesively about service journalism and how it fits into the wider news report at the New York Times. And we're actually acting on it. So Smarter Living launched in the summer of 2016, and in those very early days, it was more of an aggregator of existing stories, both new and old. So it's a combination of stories that we're publishing that day or that week, or that were published years ago that were still relevant. So we would collect these stories that were still service journalism, helping readers live better lives, and we put them through this module right here. And this was a little box on the homepage on nytimes.com, and that was the very first iteration of Smarter Living. And even now, if you go to nytimes.com right now, scroll down a little bit, and you're going to see this same box, Smarter Living. So this idea of creating stories and collecting stories that help readers live better lives and offer guidance and offer advice, the idea really, really took off. The response we got from readers was really, really good, and it exceeded all of our expectations, in a huge way. We didn't know that it was going to be so successful. We kind of knew at that point that we were really, really onto something. And we knew that it was going to be really important for readers, and we knew it was something readers really wanted and really responded to. So since those humble beginnings as a little box on the homepage that featured a couple of stories, in the last year and a half, we've expanded to a weekly newsletter, which I write, comes out every Monday morning. We have the product recommendations through Wirecutter, like we talked about. We have a whole suite of guides. So the way the New York Times looks at guides is we pick one topic and we go really, really deep on it. Sort of in the way that Wirecutter goes really deep on a product, our guides go really deep on an idea. So we have these 3,000, 4,000 word guides on literally how to be happy, or how to have a better relationship, or how to pack your suitcase. And again, it's just another story form for us to reach our readers and to offer something that they can't get anywhere else. Like, I can promise you there's no site in the world that is going to write 3,000 words about packing a carry-on suitcase. We have live chats and Q&As with our reporters and editors on a given topic. That, to me, is one of the best integrations of service journalism anywhere. And you see a lot of places doing this, but this is really the core of what service journalism is about. It's interacting directly with readers. We're responding to them in real time and getting at their questions as they answer them. As they ask them. And then, on top of that, we have all of the original just stories that we're putting out. And we have a lot of, new products and programs that we're experimenting with. The culture of experimentation at the New York Times birthed Smarter Living, and we're kind of continuing that ethos to see what the next step for us is and trying to apply those lessons to the rest of the newsroom. So we're not the only ones doing service journalism, and it's funny, we launched about 1.5 years ago, and in the last 12 months or so, we've noticed that NBC and BuzzFeed and the Washington Post and CNN and Business Insider have all sort of launched their own versions of Smarter Living in one way or the other, whether that's a new section or, a couple of reporters they're hiring just to focus on this kind of stuff. It's really kind of taking hold, and I genuinely think that 2017 was the year that U.S. news outlets really understood that service journalism is not just a fleeting trend and something that readers want. And we've been kind of failing readers up until now by not investing so heavily in it. But for us, it was less about jumping on a trend, and it was more about filling that need that we learned readers really had. So built into all of the service journalism that the Times does is a really deep foundational relationship with our reader. And so we knew a couple of things about our readers. This was done from a lot of internal research we did when we were proving the case that service journalism was worth investing in. These were the result of internal testing we did, but these are ideas that are sort of applicable to the industry. One, we knew that people who read news, just general news, also want to read service journalism. We also knew that people who don't read news wanted to read service journalism. And for us, we knew that people who want to read service journalism specifically want to read it from the New York Times. So we took all this, and we took all the data and the research and all the listening tours we did of readers, and we built that. So how did we do that? Well, I'll show you 4 tips for doing great service journalism people want to pay for. Tip number 1, listen to your readers. This is so crucial to doing service journalism. You really can't have a robust service journalism operation without having that foundational relationship with your readers. I talked a little bit earlier about the really special relationship that Times has with its readers. And, that's not just talk. We, take reader feedback and reader experience, as seriously as anything else we do. So, service journalism is, in my opinion, the most reader-focused type of journalism you can do. You literally have one goal: help the reader. If you've done that, you've succeeded. If you've created a story that, helps a reader in some way, or offers a particular piece of advice or some guidance, or, just changes their way of thinking about a certain idea or presents a new idea, you've done it. Congratulations. Your readers are going to love you for it, and they're going to shower you with subscription money, hopefully. But what does that really mean, listening to your readers? Is it reading emails? Yeah. Is it looking at tweets and responding to comments on Facebook? Yes, it is. But a lot of that stuff is kind of superficial. So to really do service journalism well, you need to take it another level deeper. And you want to really invite readers into the journalism that you're doing and into the journalism that you're reporting. So how do we do that at Smarter Living? A good example of this is the Equifax hack. So in September, the credit reporting agency Equifax in the US was breached. And Equifax has incredibly sensitive data on basically every American, data like social security numbers and addresses and credit card numbers. really, really sensitive stuff. And all that data was stolen from Equifax for about 150 million Americans. It was and continues to be, a nightmare scenario. Our most sensitive data was taken, and it's on for sale on the black market, unlike anything we've ever seen before. So it's frightening, and it's really scary, and Americans are at risk for identity theft and fraud and credit theft and worse. But so personal finance, and the Equifax hack was a personal finance story, is really huge territory for anybody writing service journalism. So I wrote about it pretty extensively for Smarter Living. But instead of chasing, the news of the day and the latest update and the new statements from Equifax or whatever, I didn't really do a lot of that because I knew that our business reporters and our finance reporters were already covering that territory. So for most of September, really those 3 or 4 weeks after the breach, I just spent time going through my inbox and my Twitter mentions and my Facebook comments, just listening to people complain and talk about how scared they were and ask questions, and just took that all in. And after a couple weeks of doing this, what we ended up doing was taking a lot of those questions and concerns, and we turned them into story ideas. So we got around half a dozen stories and newsletters just from listening. And each one of those was read by hundreds of thousands of readers. And we were able to write stories in a way that kind of nobody else could, because we were the only outlet at the time that was listening so deeply to the actual concerns of people rather than just kind of guessing what they were doing. So, kind of in a way, the readers of the Smarter Living newsletter, which is how we kind of asked a lot of those questions and did a lot of the listening that we did, they basically became assignment editors. And, both the Times and our readers kind of came out winners in the end of that. Tip 1.5, just to tuck this into listening to readers, is get good at search engine optimization. If you're fortunate to be in a newsroom with an SEO team or a specialist, that's great, because that person can be a huge resource in generating story ideas. Listening readers can be very literal and more abstract depending on the channel. So in the literal sense, it is reading your email and looking at your Twitter mentions and going on Facebook and seeing what people are talking about. But there are a lot of other ways to listen to readers that are a little bit more abstract than that. So you kind of want to figure out how to listen to readers even when they're not talking to you. So we do a lot of call-outs with Smarter Living and service journalism at the Times, soliciting story ideas and asking people what they want us to write about. And it's great. We get dozens of amazing story ideas every week just from doing that. But a lot of the times there's things that readers don't necessarily want to be admitting that they're curious about or admitting that they're wondering. A good example of this is how to survive a really fancy wedding or a really lavish wedding. So people really want to know this stuff. This is real. Surviving a really fancy wedding was a story idea that never landed in my inbox in any venue that we asked for tips. But we knew through combing through Google search data and search trends that questions around dealing with really fancy weddings was something that people were searching for all the time. The search volume for this was huge. It was enormous. So we wrote a story around it. And again, this is not anything readers ever told us they wanted us to look into. We had to kind of seek out the idea that they wanted us to write about that. And by the way, that question turned into how to survive a lavish wedding. And if you go right now, if you Google any variation of how do I survive a fancy wedding? What do I do at a really expensive wedding? We're the first result for that. So tip number 2, diversify your distribution channels. So homepages and article pages are crucial and always will be to a certain degree. However, as social media and search engines and texting apps and Facebook and Snapchat become increasing ways that people are discovering news, homepages are becoming a lot less important. And at a lot of news outlets, homepage traffic has kind of stagnated. People just don't go to their browser and type a URL for a news outlet anymore. So, we as an industry need to be a little bit more forward-thinking and, go where readers already are and figure out how to reach them. And especially as we're launching new products and new services and new verticals that are aimed at getting new readers and, hopefully, making money from that. This is an idea that we really built very deeply into Smarter Living. So when we first launched, like I mentioned earlier, we had a little box on the homepage, and that was it. And that was fine for the early days because we didn't know what we were doing, we didn't know how to do it, so it was fine that that was the only place we lived. It did the job. But a couple months in, when we started to realize that Smarter Living could be something really, really cool, the time came where we had to prove the case that the New York Times should invest in service journalism, that it was an idea worth expanding on. But we wanted to prove that we could do it without relying on the homepage. Because, at somewhere like the New York Times or CNN or the Washington Post, anything that's on the homepage is always going to do well. So it's kind of hard to gauge whether something is really doing well or whether it's doing well because it has great homepage placement. So we designed an experiment where, for a whole week, we partnered with 8 desks throughout the newsroom to create around 50 or so pieces of original service journalism content. Everything from health and wellness stories to travel and cooking and real estate, all across the newsroom. But the catch was, none of those stories ever appeared on nytimes.com. We had to figure out how to get them to readers without using the traditional distribution methods. So how did we do that? We ensured that everything was optimized for social sharing. And this is another one of those things that, we all have kind of heard a lot about, that we need to make sure things are set to do well on Twitter and Facebook and wherever else we're putting them. But as websites and news websites become less and less important, this is something that we can't not take incredibly seriously anymore, particularly social. It's really kind of the future, and we need to design stories in ways that after a reader reads it, they think to themselves, this is so, so good, and I want all my friends to read it, so I'm going to throw it on Facebook. So we built that into the core of Smarter Living. Sort of in the same way, we made sure that everything was optimized for search. If your story is not findable, you're really cutting off a huge swath of readership. So there are technical aspects to that we don't have to get into, but this sort of speaks to what I was talking about earlier in listening to readers. Creating stories that address questions and issues that people are searching for is a great content strategy, and it's one of the core strategies for Smarter Living. Great. We looked at different newsletter opportunities, and we haven't talked a lot about newsletters as a distribution channel yet, but so the New York Times has about 60 editorial newsletters. And so we were able to take advantage of a lot of those, and that allowed us to reach a brand new audience that didn't even know the New York Times does service journalism. But it's just another one of those channels that is at our disposal. Partnering with other news outlets is something that I think is particularly exciting because it really does allow you to literally reach an audience that can potentially be 100% brand new. And this can be as simple as like a social sharing swap where you say to a news outlet, hey, we'll put your stories on our Facebook page if you put ours on yours, to deeper partnerships where you're promoting each other in newsletters or on a homepage or in an article page. There are a lot of ways to do that, but it allows you to expose your content to completely new audiences. And last, we haven't really talked about this, but we had to make sure that our stories looked great on mobile. And in the US, this is kind of the standard that you have to be a mobile-first news outlet to be competitive. For the majority of US newsrooms, at least, most people are coming through mobile devices, so your smartphones and tablets and things like that. At the Times, over 50% of our readership comes from mobile and tablets, not on a desktop. And any one of these bullets could be a presentation on its own, but the idea here is you can't depend on one distribution channel anymore to get your stories to readers. And up until 20 years ago, 25 years ago, there were really only two things that newspapers had to worry about in terms of distribution. And that was, one, did our stories look good in a newspaper? And two, could we physically get those newspapers to subscribers? You know, there were a lot of smaller things that we had to worry about, of course, but if you were good at those two things, you were really in pretty good shape. But now we have, WhatsApp and Google and Facebook and push alerts and Snapchat and 100 other ways to get our stories to readers. And there was a graph yesterday that Emily Bell had in her presentation that I thought was just amazing, where it showed handful of news outlets and then all the places online that they're putting their stories, their content. And the chart was filled in with tons of green bubbles showing that these outlets were putting their stories everywhere. And that's real. Like, that's really kind of how it is. When I was an editor at the Washington Post, we were really, really aggressive about getting our stories on different platforms and different social networks, almost to the point of being completely platform agnostic. We didn't really care where you were reading the Washington Post. We just cared that you were reading us. And there's a lot of benefits and a lot of drawbacks to that. But again, the point is just to think about platforms that feel right for a given story and pursue those. Tip 3, not every story needs to be a story. One of my favorite things that Smarter Living has published this year, and one of our biggest stories, was this story about remaining childless after marriage. And there's a lot of ways you can tackle that idea. You could do like a personal essay, or like a Q&A with a therapist, or just like a standard 800-word news feature story with facts and statistics about childbirth. And those are all fine. Those would be a great way to tell this story. But when we were workshopping this one, it just felt like we had an opportunity to do something that felt a little more organic and a little more natural and just a little different. So instead of putting together that 800-word news feature story like we might have done 2 or 3 years ago, I asked the writer to break it up into 2 separate parts. The first was sort of a personal narrative that she used as a springboard into the topic that drew from her experience with this. And then the second section, the second half of that story, was a handful of themed standalone subsections that wove in her personal history alongside all that advice and guidance and data and statistics and stuff from health experts. And it's a completely different way and a completely different story structure to be telling these stories. And it's really difficult to pull off. But when you do, it can really capture an idea or a thought in a way that just a standard news story can't. And it really lets an idea take hold with readers in a way that traditional story forms and traditional ways of telling these stories just can't. And one other quick example of this idea about story forms was yesterday's Smarter Living newsletter, which again I write, comes out every Monday. But we wanted to write about counting calories when you're dieting. So we could have done just like a standard story about the pros and cons and whether it's helpful or harmful or all that. But that just didn't feel right. That didn't feel like the best way to tell that story for readers. So what we ended up doing was, it was a Q&A. It was me and a registered dietitian talking back and forth, super conversationally, super casual, basically just like we were on Google Chat, Hangouts, just like talking to each other like friends. And we put that into the newsletter. And we sent it to all our subscribers and got really, really positive feedback because we were taking a story that can be pretty serious and making it really personable and really relatable. And I just felt we really captured the essence of what we were trying to hit with that story. And as a side note, I'll assume you're all subscribers to the Smarter Living newsletter. If not, go subscribe. It's amazing. It'll change your life. Please subscribe. But really the point is just to think about how presenting a given story will best serve the reader. Mixing things up can unlock a lot of different things for your newsroom and for your readers. And that's a great segue into my final tip here, which is to get weird. Challenge your readers. Give them the unexpected and trust that they can handle it. Every day at work, I'm saying yes to ideas that 3 years ago or 4 years ago, the New York Times probably wouldn't have done, either because they felt, insubstantial, or they were in a coverage area that we just didn't dabble in, or they just didn't feel like a New York Times story, But the fact is, every one of us at the New York Times and every one of us sitting in this room serves our readers. And if there's a genuine need from readers for a topic or a story idea or an area of coverage, it's our responsibility to respond to that. We're not in an age where we can say, oh, we weren't listening or we didn't have the tools to get those kinds of ideas from readers. Now we do. So there's no excuse for not doing that. And we fail at this a lot. It's a fact. I have stories I publish that, in retrospect, I wish I would have done differently. I've written stories that I wish I would have done differently, wish I could take back. And, we all do. That's just kind of the industry. But it's a cliche, but it's an important thing to remember that failing often and failing hard is the only way that we can improve. The New York Times has had to change a lot about itself over the last few years. I was having this conversation at dinner last night with a couple of you, but the New York Times is still kind of colloquially known as the Gray Lady. But that stodgy, traditionalist nickname, or the image that nickname evokes, it's really not who we are anymore. We're learning and we're evolving like everyone in the industry. And, we have our fair share of missteps. Sure, everyone does. But, we also are able to get into new areas and ideas and story forms and platforms that we never would have experimented with before. And we're able to have a real genuine lasting impact on readers in ways that we never could before. So experimenting is hard, and it's scary, and it's time-consuming. But it's rewarding. And ultimately, our readers and our newsrooms, and ideally, kind of our societies at large, are going to be better for it. So, these new ways of thinking about news is how the industry is going to thrive for the next 10 or 20 or 50 years. And I think that's a really hopeful thought. We've talked a lot about kind of the doom and gloom and all the things that are wrong with the industry, but, I think we're at a moment where we're able to think ourselves out of it. And I think, at this conference this morning and yesterday, we've heard so many exciting ideas about exciting innovations that are happening in the media. And I think that's really heartening. And I think it's a really, really good time to be involved in this kind of stuff. So thank you so much for the pleasure and the opportunity to speak here. This has been a true honor. Please email me. I'm at tim@nytimes.com. Find me on Twitter. And I would love to talk with you, answer any questions or anything like that. And again, thank you again so much for having me. This is such an honor.
네, 스마터 리빙으로 대표되는 뉴욕타임스의 지금 서비스 저널리즘에 대해서 설명을 해주신 팀 에레라 수석 에디터님께 다시 한번 감사를 드리겠습니다. 저희가 질문이 이번에는 좀 짤막짤막하게 들어와서 3가지 질문을 골랐고요. 첫 번째 질문부터 드리도록 하겠습니다. 스마터 리빙에 대한 질문입니다. 지금 통역기를 착용하셨으니까 영어로 되어 있어서 들으셔도 될 것 같은데요. How is the average age of the journalists, writers in Smarter Living section and the average age of readers?
Great. Average age of journalists, writers, and Smarter Living, and average age of readers. That's a great question, and I didn't get to speak a lot about that during my presentation, but Smarter Living was designed to reach younger readers. So the writers and reporters that we have on staff and the freelancers we work with generally skew a little bit younger than other parts of the newsroom. And that's sort of by design, to reach this younger audience, and again, the audience that's going to sustain the New York Times for the next 40 and 50 years. Right now they're in their 20s and their 30s and their early 40s, and that's the audience that we need to really be reaching out to right now, and Smarter Living was sort of built to do that. It's a great question.
네, 그 다음 질문입니다. 역시 서비스 저널리즘과 관련된 질문인데요. 서비스 저널리즘은 새로운 독자 개발과 수익에 얼마나 도움이 될까요? 또 뉴욕타임스 기자가 와이어 커터의 상품 추천 리뷰를 쓰기도 하는지요? 그리고 뉴욕타임스에 대한 독자의 신뢰가 와이어 커터 이용자들에게 영향을 미친다고 생각하시나요?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of the question, but I think it was about revenue and how readers perceive Wirecutter. Is that right?
네, 첫 번째 질문은 그러니까 service journal, how does the service journalism contribute to the revenue of the New York Times?
Oh, great. So the most immediate and right now kind of the most exciting way is through Wirecutter. It's a completely brand new idea to the New York Times. It's called affiliate revenue. It's something we've never done before, and we only started doing it when we acquired Wirecutter last fall. And it's, it's been interesting seeing that kind of business model folded into the New York Times. The Wirecutter as a product absolutely has content that is up to New York Times standards. In terms of product recommendation, there's not a better website that does that. So quality-wise, they're on par with the New York Times. They happen to make their money in a very different way than the New York Times does. But it's really exciting. And we always be very transparent and very open about that with readers. So if you ever see a Wirecutter story or any partnership between Wirecutter and the New York Times newsroom, we're always very upfront with the idea that it's possible we'll make money if a reader buys a product in that story. It's really important to us just to be totally open and totally transparent with our readers, because there are other outlets in the US that are not as open and not as transparent. And it feels really bad for readers. They feel duped, and we never want to do that.
네, 이번 질문에 대한 답변은 여기까지 하고요. 그 다음 질문 바로 이어가겠습니다. 한국의 상황을 좀 설명을 드리고 말씀을 드리겠는데요. 스토리 포맷을 바꿔가는 실험을 했을 때 내부 뉴스룸에서 그게 기사냐, 그게 저널리즘이냐, 버즈피드랑 뭐가 다르냐 이런 비판을 들으신 적은 없으신가요? 라고 하면은 뭐라고 답변하거나 반박하십니까? 참고로 연성 뉴스에 대한 저널리스트의 거부감이 한국에서는 심한 편입니다.
I love this question. This is my favorite question to get. It's such a good question. So I kind of have a standard way to answer that. So the New York Times right now is, like we discussed earlier, known for the really important investigations we do and the really important political news we do. But we're also known for a lot of the really good styles stuff we do and a lot of the really good fashion stuff we do and a lot of the food and cooking stuff we do. The cooking app is one of our biggest successes in the entire company. So right now, that feels something that's so natural to the New York Times. It's part of the fabric of the New York Times. It's part of our DNA. These, you could call them softer sections, were launched in the 1970s. The New York Times invented the concept of a lifestyle section, which is what you would call now kind of softer news. And when the New York Times introduced that in the 1970s, it was one to fill a content hole that we had. We weren't covering it at that time, but it was to get new advertising revenue from advertisers who wanted to be associated with that softer news. When the New York Times launched that, there was basically almost a revolt in the newsroom, and there was a shock through the industry. And people would say, this is not the New York Times. This is them totally dumbing themselves down, doing entirely inappropriate things. And now, this is some of the stuff that people love about the New York Times. So yes, we face that criticism every so often with Smarter Living. Particularly as it relates to Wirecutter, because that's so new and so vastly different from what the New York Times has traditionally done. There is, some reticence around that. And, externally there can be criticism about what is the New York Times doing with a product recommendation site. But, I can absolutely guarantee you, promise you that in 10 years, we'll look back and think, wasn't it weird when the New York Times didn't have product recommendations?